Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for May 2nd, 2024. As we're living in a world of media spin and fake news, I'm going to try and take a look through the fog surrounding what some people are calling the Joe Biden presidential campaign strategy to give you a sense of what's really going on. And it is an Alice in Wonderland make-believe world. So I hope you are ready for this because it really is quite astounding what they expect you're willing to swallow. Let's start with the actual policies that he's implementing to facilitate this election strategy. First, keep supporting Israel while feigning concern over the deaths of tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians. In other words, keep the funds going to Israel and the orders for munitions going to the military-industrial financial complex, and at the same time assert that you don't want the invasion into Rafah, but not doing the one thing that would stop it, namely cutting off those funds. Secondly, keep the Ukraine war going. 60 billion is not enough. It's going to be more and more and more, as the Ukrainians themselves are demanding. But the reality is Ukraine cannot win. But Biden doesn't want to run for president as the man who lost Ukraine. So he has to keep the war going at least until after the November elections. And then third, something that just came up, which is legalizing marijuana, which is a new administration policy. According to the Financial Times, it said that reviewing the classification of marijuana has emerged as a top political priority for President Biden in recent months, as he's battled to shore up the youth vote ahead of the November election, pitting him against Donald Trump. Well, that's one way to do it. Drug the youth so they won't be able to have the energy to participate in opposition to Biden's policies. Now, what he's obviously doing is using defense spending, wars, the green infrastructure boondoggle, and laundering drug money to produce an effect of an economic recovery, when for the vast majority of Americans, the reality is different. There's no recovery. There's less money that by the end of the month, month after month after month, the debt is growing and the way out of this is not in sight. But if you can get enough people smoking marijuana, maybe they won't pay attention to that. Now, what's the real issue behind this? It's defending the policy of the unipolar order. The United States as the sole superpower which can dictate terms to the rest of the world, which are beneficial to the corporate billionaires who are funding the Biden campaign. And many of them, by the way, are also funding the Trump campaign. But what's their concern? To stop the emergence of a new financial system, to counter the moves by the BRICS and nations of the global south to break out from under the neo-colonial policies of the City of London and Wall Street, and to end the neo-colonial looting policy. Now, the congressional vote for the Ukraine war, support for Israel, and the $8 billion to fund the Indo-Pacific, that is Taiwan war, that's what the reality is of the administration policy, to continue the wars, the endless wars, with no possibility of negotiations acceptable. Now, that's the message of the current Blinken tour. He essentially presented a carrot and stick approach to Beijing to split with Russia, break the Russia-China alliance, or else. Or else what? Another war? Then he went to the Middle East to make a deal with the Saudis, to drop their opposition to alliance with Israel and sign a mutual defense agreement. Now, who else is pushing this? Well, here's an interesting thing. Larry Fink of BlackRock was recently in Saudi Arabia, and they signed a deal with the Saudi government to launch something called BlackRock Riyadh Investment Management. Essentially, this would create a $5 billion Saudi seed capital fund to, quote, manage funds that invest primarily in Saudi Arabia, but also in the rest of the Middle East and North Africa. Fink, in a statement, said, quote, Saudi Arabia has become an increasingly attractive destination for international investment, and we are pleased to offer investors from around the world the opportunity to take part. Of course he's pleased to do that. Where else is Fink involved right now? Ukraine. BlackRock is moving to take over the resources wherever they can. Will the Saudis fall for this? Well, we'll see. Now, at the same time, you have an attempt to expand censorship, the so-called censorship industrial complex, to protect the corrupt and unconstitutional practices of the administration, with full bipartisan support. The House, by a 320 to 91 vote, broadened the definition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel as an example of anti-Semitic action. Just as Netanyahu demanded in a video last week that the U.S. crack down on so-called anti-Semitism. What is anti-Semitism for Netanyahu? Criticism of his genocidal policy towards the Palestinians. If you oppose that, as tens of thousands are now on college campuses, you'll be labeled anti-Semites. Now, what are they doing with this? They're empowering a thought police to make the determination that you have to think properly or else you become a criminal. Now, many Jewish organizations oppose this bill. In fact, it's clear that there are many Jewish protesters who are joining in on the campuses in protest of the policy of Israel. They're being labeled pro-Hamas terrorists by supporters of this legislation. There's even a proposal from two congressmen from New York to set up an anti-Semitism monitoring agency on campuses. Well, will this soon extend to businesses, to neighborhood watch groups, people reporting on you if they think that you're exhibiting anti-Semitic tendencies, meaning disagreeing with the policies of genocide in the Middle East? Now, you should note that the people who are supporting these measures are the same people who just voted to reauthorize the FISA Act to spy on Americans. And remember, when the FISA Act was brought up, it had to be reauthorized by the middle of last month. There was a question of whether there would be an amendment to include a prohibition against warrantless wiretaps. In other words, the practice that was used to launch the whole Russiagate fraud against Donald Trump. Here's the irony. Supposedly pro-Trump Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, broke the tie. There was a 212 to 212 tie on the amendment, and he voted to defeat the amendment, meaning that warrantless wiretapping would continue. And then the bill as a whole was passed by a bipartisan majority in the House of Representatives. This takes away the constitutional protection of free speech and free press. And the fact that Johnson was at the center of this is quite interesting. And now when Republicans are rebelling against Johnson, former President Trump is telling them to lay off the speaker. He's got a tough job. Now, interestingly, House Democrats are moving to protect Speaker Johnson and keep him in his position. They're calling those pushing for his removal as part of a pro-Putin Russian obstruction. Now, that's quite rich. You know who's part of that pushing that is Nancy Pelosi. Pelosi said protesters are, quote, connected to Russia, unquote. And she said ceasefire is Mr. Putin's message. So if a campus protester is calling for a ceasefire, according to Nancy Pelosi, he's likely, or she is likely, on a payroll of the Russian President Putin. Now, where does this get more tricky? Well, President Trump, former President Trump, put out a statement over the weekend, at the beginning of this week, describing protesters as, quote, raging lunatics, unquote, and tweeted out, stop the protests now, unquote. Now, what's interesting here is that support for Israel is bringing together Trump, Biden, and Pelosi in support of the military industrial financial complex or deep state or secret government's commitment to continuing to support the wars that drive up the government deficit, that turn most of the world against the United States, and are going to end up as losing propositions. Now, in this context, I want to call your attention to the dialogue that I had with Helga Zepp-LaRouche a couple of days ago, where she went after this policy and described the student demonstrations as a sign of intelligent life. Here's a quote from her in talking about what we're facing. The efforts to maintain the power structure of the unipolar world by promoting the Ukraine war, the war in the Middle East, by trying to extend global NATO, all these are efforts to maintain and actually expand the existing order and will not succeed. There's no way in this universe, she said, that the effort to go back to a status quo where the US is the world policeman and the European allies are just servile slaves, a world run on the assumed and imagined moral superiority of the West, this is completely out, unquote. Well, I think it would be very important that this dialogue I had with Helga Zepp-LaRouche get out as widely as possible, because we have to provide an in-depth understanding that everything that we see, which seems so crazy, it is crazy, but it's part of an operation designed to keep the United States government and people, or keep the United States people unaware of what the government is doing on behalf of global corporations and corporate cartel billionaires who intend to extend permanently the unipolar order for their interests, not for yours. So today's Thursday. Tomorrow we'll have your questions. You can send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com, and I'll see you then.